Imagine a weapon so massive it could not cross a single bridge in Europe. Imagine a machine of war so heavy it would sink deep into the earth beneath its own steel tracks. Picture a steel behemoth so large the enemy could spot its shadow from miles away. Yet this absolute monster was a genuine military plan. The High Command believed this moving fortress could turn the tide of the entire conflict. This is the story of the Landkreuzer Ratte. It was a machine born not from strategic brilliance, but from pure and unchecked desperation. The conflict was turning against the German forces on multiple fronts. The leaders needed a miracle weapon to crush the advancing Allied armies. They demanded a machine that could dominate the battlefield through sheer size and terror. The drawing boards in Berlin became a breeding ground for impossible ideas. Engineers stopped designing practical vehicles and started dreaming of invincible titans. The concept of the traditional tank vanished from their minds. They envisioned a land cruiser that operated like a naval battleship on dirt. The sheer scale of the proposal defied all bounds of standard engineering. The plans called for a vehicle weighing over 1,000 tons. To put that massive number in perspective, standard heavy tanks of the era weighed around 60 tons. This proposed monster was equivalent to a moving apartment building packed with high explosives and heavy armor. It was designed to crush entire towns beneath its massive treads. The sheer ambition of the project bordered on pure madness. The main armament required a turret taken straight from a naval warship. The giant cannons were designed to sink heavy cruisers in the ocean, not to fight standard ground battles. Firing these massive guns would create a shock wave capable of shattering windows miles away. The recoil alone possessed enough force to rip a normal vehicle apart. But this was no normal vehicle. A crew of over 20 men was needed just to operate the basic systems. They would live inside the steel belly of the beast during long campaigns. The interior required massive diesel engines borrowed from submarines to generate enough power. The noise inside the hull would deafen the mechanics working near the roaring exhaust pipes. It was a suffocating steel cave filled with oil fumes and extreme heat. The outside of the behemoth featured an array of smaller anti-aircraft guns to protect the roof. The designers knew the massive size made it an impossible target to miss from the sky. Allied bombers would spot the giant shadow moving across the fields and swarm it like angry hornets. The roof needed a constant barrage of defensive fire to keep the enemy planes at bay. It was a self-contained army rolling on custom tracks. But the grand vision on paper ignored the harsh reality of the physical world. The men drawing the blueprints sat in comfortable offices, far from the mud and the ruined roads of the front lines. They imagined a flat and solid world where 1,000 tons of steel could glide without resistance. They ignored the swamps, the rivers, and the fragile infrastructure of the European continent. A machine of this magnitude demanded a perfect environment to function. But war never provides a perfect environment. The battlefields were torn apart by artillery craters and constant rain. The heavy mud swallowed standard vehicles with ease. Placing 1,000 tons of steel into that chaotic landscape was a recipe for an instant disaster. The sheer weight of the machine became its own worst enemy. No concrete bridge in existence could support a fraction of that massive burden. Crossing a simple river meant driving down into the water and hoping the engine intakes stayed dry. The mud at the bottom of the riverbed would trap the giant tracks in an unbreakable grip. The supreme weapon of war was a prisoner of its own mass. The desperation of the High Command blinded them to these obvious fatal flaws. They wanted a psychological weapon to break the spirit of the enemy troops. They poured precious resources and time into drafting the blueprints for a monster that the Earth itself could not support. The story of this colossal failure proves that vigor is not a guarantee of success. The German war machine faced a massive crisis of resources on all fronts. Fuel reserves dropped to critical levels as the conflict dragged into another winter. Regular armored units abandoned their vehicles on the side of the road because the gas tanks ran dry. Yet the men in the design bureaus ignored this glaring and obvious issue. They drafted plans for a behemoth that required an ocean of diesel to move a single mile. Two massive submarine engines were chosen to power the steel fortress across the ruined landscape. These marine power plants consumed fuel at a staggering rate just to turn the massive pistons over. A standard combat vehicle used a fraction of that energy during a full week of intense fighting. The logistics of keeping this monster fed bordered on pure fiction and absolute fantasy. Feeding the beast required a dedicated fleet of tanker trucks following close behind the main tracks. But tanker trucks were prime targets for roaming Allied fighter planes in the open skies. A massive convoy of fuel transports invited absolute destruction from the air. The enemy pilots would spot the cargo train and obliterate the trucks long before they reached the giant machine. Without a constant river of diesel, the supreme weapon of the German army was nothing but a stationary steel bunker. The fuel problem extended far beyond the constant threat of enemy fire from the clouds. Pumping thousands of gallons of diesel into the massive internal tanks required specialized equipment. It demanded hours of vulnerable downtime where the crew could not move or defend the vehicle. The crew could not just pull into a safe depot and fill the tanks in a matter of minutes. The refueling process forced the giant machine to sit idle in the open terrain without any cover. An idle target of that massive size was a guaranteed death sentence in modern warfare. The Allied reconnaissance planes possessed absolute air superiority over the shrinking German borders. They mapped every inch of the landscape with high-resolution cameras to hunt for enemy movements. 1,000 tons of steel sitting in a field was impossible to hide from the glass lens. Camouflage netting provided zero protection against a silhouette the size of an apartment building. The dark shadow cast by the main gun barrel alone could betray its position to an observant pilot. The engineers proposed painting the massive hull in disruptive patterns to blend with the surrounding trees. But mere paint cannot disguise a machine that crushes the very forest it attempts to hide behind. The colossal weight guaranteed that finding a stable refueling point was a nightmare of its own. Soft dirt roads turned into deep trenches under the extreme pressure of the massive steel treads. A fleet of standard transport trucks attempting to reach the stationary Titan would sink in the ruined mud. The giant created an impassable wasteland in its own wake, destroying the infrastructure it needed to survive. The sheer heat generated by the submarine engines added another layer of extreme danger to the mission. The massive exhaust pipes glowed red-hot during standard operations in the field. Pouring aviation fuel or diesel near those vents risked a catastrophic internal explosion. One mistake from an exhausted mechanic could detonate the entire fortress from the inside out. A fire inside the center of the beast offered zero chance of survival for the trapped crew. The thick armor plates designed to keep enemy shells out also kept the heat and the flames locked inside. The narrow metal corridors and the steep ladders turned the interior into a complex maze of steel. Escaping the inferno required navigating a dark labyrinth while the air turned to toxic smoke. The men stationed near the massive engine blocks faced an environment of pure physical torture. The roaring noise of the submarine power plants shattered their eardrums and made verbal communication impossible. They communicated through hand signals in the dim light of bare electric bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The vibration of the giant pistons rattled their bones and drained their physical strength with every passing hour. The High Command ignored the severe human cost of operating the massive machine in a combat zone. They viewed the crew as mere cogs in the ultimate weapon of total destruction. But a grand machine without fuel or a functional crew is just a monument to wasted ambition. The engineering problems increased when the designers looked at the map of the European continent. The physical environment presented obstacles that no amount of thick armor could ever defeat. Europe is a landscape defined by deep rivers, ancient stone bridges, and dense urban centers. Moving 1,000 tons of steel across this delicate terrain was a mathematical impossibility. Standard bridges were rated to hold a fraction of the weight of this massive land cruiser. Attempting to cross a concrete or stone structure would result in immediate and catastrophic collapse. The heavy tank would smash through the road and plunge straight into the deep water below. The steep banks of the rivers offered no alternative routes for a machine with such massive dimensions. The engineers suggested sealing the hull to allow the behemoth to drive along the bottom of the riverbed. But the soft mud under the water would trap the giant tracks in an unbreakable grip. The supreme weapon of war would become a permanent submarine stuck in the dirt. The streets of ancient European towns were too narrow for the massive chassis to squeeze through. The tank would have to crush entire blocks of houses just to make a simple turn. The rubble from the destroyed buildings would pile up and eventually jam the massive steel treads. The vehicle was a prisoner of its own extreme mass, unable to maneuver in the real world. The grand vision of the giant land cruiser was drowning in the harsh realities of basic physics. The designers created a monster that the Earth itself refused to support. The desperation of the German leaders blinded them to the obvious laws of nature and engineering. They poured precious time into drafting blueprints for a weapon that defeated itself before it even fired a shot. The impossible tank was a masterpiece of absolute delusion. The German High Command envisioned an invincible land fortress crushing everything in its path. But they ignored a crucial shift in the nature of modern combat. The ground was no longer the ultimate domain of the war. The Allied forces possessed absolute control of the skies over the shrinking European borders. Thousands of British and American bombers filled the clouds with devastating power. They hunted industrial targets and train yards with ruthless precision and overwhelming numbers. A traditional combat vehicle could hide from these massive formations in thick forests or deep valleys. A machine the size of a 1,000-ton cruiser possessed no such luxury. The towering steel hull of the Ratte reached the height of a 4-story structure. The sheer scale made it the ultimate magnet for every enemy pilot within 100 miles. It cast a massive dark shadow that stretched across the open fields and ruined towns. A bomber crew could spot this moving mountain from the edge of the horizon. The giant land cruiser was impossible to conceal under camouflage nets or fake foliage. The engine exhaust alone generated a massive plume of thick black smoke rising into the atmosphere. This dark pillar acted as a beacon to guide swarms of heavy bombers straight to the target. The supreme weapon of the German army was a gigantic moving bullseye. Precision aiming was unnecessary when attacking a target of this massive magnitude. The Allied air forces carried specialized ordnance designed to shatter concrete bunkers and sink massive warships. These heavy bombs possessed enough kinetic energy to crack the earth and cause localized earthquakes. The Ratte would face a continuous rain of these devastating high explosives. The German designers understood the severe threat from the air and attempted to counter it. They planned to mount multiple anti-aircraft cannons on the flat roof of the behemoth. The blueprints detailed a complex array of flak guns and rapid-fire turrets pointing at the sky. They envisioned a dome of defensive fire protecting the giant machine from aerial assault. But theoretical math on a drafting table never survives the chaotic reality of a real battlefield. The sheer number of Allied planes would overwhelm the isolated defenders on the roof. A swarm of fighter bombers, striking from multiple directions, would saturate the defensive perimeter. The gunners standing exposed on the top deck would face absolute slaughter. Once the roof defenders were eliminated, the giant tank became a defenseless metal tortoise. The heavy bombers could circle above the crippled beast and drop their payloads with zero interference. The thick steel armor plating on the top of the hull was designed to withstand massive punishment, but repeated strikes from thousands of pounds of high explosives would fracture the steel. The men trapped inside the dark belly of the Ratte would experience a psychological nightmare. They would hear the roar of the incoming planes through the thick metal walls of their prison. The deafening explosions on the roof would turn the interior into an echoing chamber of pure terror. The shock waves would rupture eardrums and throw the crew against the sharp steel bulkheads. The sheer concussive force of the bombs posed a lethal threat, even without penetrating the armor. The massive vibrations would shatter the delicate optical instruments and primitive electronic systems. The intense shock would snap bolts and send jagged metal shrapnel bouncing around the confined cabin space. The invincible fortress would become a tomb of high pressure and suffocating smoke. A direct hit to the massive track system would seal the fate of the entire operation. The Ratte relied on custom steel treads that were wider than most standard country roads. Snapping one of these massive tracks would immobilize the 1,000-ton monster in the mud. The tank would spin in a circle and grind to a permanent halt in the open dirt. Repairing a broken track of that size in the middle of a combat zone was a physical impossibility. A standard tank crew could replace a broken link with heavy crowbars and pure muscle. The treads on the Landkreuzer weighed tons and required massive industrial cranes to move. Bringing heavy repair equipment to a targeted war zone was a suicidal endeavor. An immobilized Ratte was no longer a mobile fortress commanding the battlefield. It was a stranded mountain of expensive steel waiting to be torn apart by relentless airstrikes. The Allied commanders would use the stationary giant as target practice for their rookie bomber crews. The pride of the German engineering division would rust away in a crater of its own making. The designers imagined the massive machine driving fear into the hearts of the enemy troops. They wanted the sheer size of the vehicle to break the morale of the opposing armies. But the Allied soldiers would view the behemoth as a massive strategic blunder and a waste of resources. They knew the giant tank was far too slow to pose an immediate tactical threat. The massive Landkreuzer possessed a top speed that rivaled a slow walk. A soldier on foot could outpace the roaring steel monster across a flat and open field. The slow speed made it impossible to surprise the enemy or exploit a sudden breach in the lines. The Allied forces could see the attack coming for days and plan a devastating ambush. The slow advance gave the enemy ample time to evacuate towns and destroy the local infrastructure. The retreating forces would blow up the limited bridges and flood the low valleys. They would turn the landscape into a massive trap designed to swallow the 1,000-ton beast. The environment itself became the ultimate weapon against the oversized machine. The German commanders failed to grasp that mobility was the true key to armored warfare. A fast and reliable tank could strike weak points and retreat before the enemy could react. The massive Landkreuzer sacrificed all maneuverability in exchange for thick armor and oversized naval cannons. It was a dinosaur of war wandering into an era defined by speed and precision. The sheer arrogance of the design blinded the creators to the changing tide of the conflict. They ignored the practical lessons learned from years of brutal combat in the snow and the mud. The engineers fell in love with the sheer scale of the blueprints and forgot the purpose of the machine. They built a theoretical god of war that could never survive the harsh elements of reality. The resources required to build a single Ratte could produce hundreds of standard and effective combat vehicles. The steel alone could armor a massive fleet of reliable tanks that could traverse the European terrain. The obsession with a single giant weapon drained vital materials from the collapsing German war effort. The impossible dream starved the actual soldiers fighting on the desperate front lines. The project represented a fundamental disconnect between the high command and the grim reality of the war. The leaders in Berlin demanded miracles to reverse their impending defeat at the hands of the Allied forces. They placed their faith in absurd superweapons instead of addressing the massive strategic failures of their campaigns. The giant tank was a symbol of a dying empire grasping at impossible straws. The massive naval turrets were meant to dominate the ground, but they were pointing at the wrong domain. The true danger came from the clouds above, where thousands of planes hunted with absolute impunity. The Landkreuzer was an oversized target painted with a massive bullseye for the enemy bombers. The invincible machine was born obsolete. The nightmare of the skies ensured that the behemoth could never fulfill its destructive promise. The brilliant engineers had designed the ultimate weapon for a war that no longer existed. The harsh truth of the battlefield proved that size and heavy armor offered no protection against absolute air supremacy. The impossible tank was nothing but a 1,000-ton coffin waiting for the inevitable bombs to fall. The core concept of the Ratte involved mounting a massive naval turret on a moving steel chassis. The designers took the main guns from a heavy battle cruiser and placed them on dirt. These twin cannons possessed enough firepower to shatter a modern warship in the middle of the ocean. Firing weapons of this incredible magnitude required a massive and stable platform to absorb the recoil. A ship uses the displacement of thousands of tons of water to cushion the violent shock wave. But the Landkreuzer possessed no such advantage on the hard ground of the European continent. The sheer force of the blast would transfer straight down into the tracks and the earth below. The engineers ignored the catastrophic impact this violent energy would have on the internal mechanics. The shock of a single shot could shatter the delicate transmissions and snap the massive steel gears. The gunners inside the turret faced a terrifying environment every time they pulled the heavy trigger. The deafening roar of the naval cannons would echo through the confined space of the metal dome. The immense pressure wave would turn the air into a physical weapon against the trapped crew. Operating a naval turret on land created severe tactical blind spots for the giant machine. These massive guns were built to engage enemy fleets over vast stretches of open water. They required long distances to calculate the arc of the heavy explosive shells. The battlefields of Europe offered zero opportunities for this type of extreme long-range combat. Dense forests and rolling hills blocked the line of sight required to aim the giant weapons. The tank would have to destroy the landscape just to find a clear path for the massive projectiles. Firing at a close target was a mathematical impossibility for the massive naval guns. The long barrels could not depress low enough to hit standard tanks or approaching infantry units. A fast enemy vehicle could drive right up to the base of the Ratte and remain safe from the blast. The giant cannons would point useless in the sky while the enemy swarmed the steel tracks. The designers added smaller anti-tank guns to the hull to protect the massive blind spots. But the sheer size of the behemoth created a maze of dead zones that no secondary weapon could cover. The environmental destruction caused by the main guns posed a massive threat to the tank itself. The blast wave from the muzzle would obliterate everything within a massive radius of the front hull. Trees and stone walls would vaporize into a storm of lethal shrapnel. Any Allied or German foot soldiers caught near the giant machine would face absolute devastation. The Ratte required a massive escort of troops to protect it from enemy sabotage. but the escorts could not survive the explosive overpressure generated by their own supreme weapon. The massive tank would have to fight alone because its own firepower made cooperation a lethal hazard. The isolation turned the behemoth into a solitary giant, wandering the ruined fields of war. A lone target of that size invited coordinated attacks from fast and agile enemy platoons. Loading the giant shells into the breach was a monumental task of brutal physical labor. The ammunition weighed hundreds of pounds and required mechanical hoists to lift from the magazines. The complex elevator systems were prone to jamming under the extreme stress of combat conditions. A broken hoist inside the turret meant the ultimate weapon was nothing but a silent metal tower. The exhausted crew would have to move the massive explosives by hand in the dark and cramped space. The slow rate of fire made the Landkreuzer useless in a fast-paced armored engagement. The target could move miles away before the gunners could load and fire a second round. Modern tank combat depended on rapid shots and quick adjustments to defeat the enemy armor. The Ratte operated on the slow and methodical timeline of a naval bombardment. The massive ammunition reserves required massive storage rooms inside the center of the beast. Hundreds of giant, high-explosive shells sat inches away from the roaring submarine engines. The interior of the tank was a massive powder keg, waiting for a single spark to ignite. A penetration from an enemy bomb or an internal fire would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. The resulting explosion would vaporize the 1,000-ton machine and leave nothing but a massive crater in the dirt. The crew lived and worked inside the most dangerous enclosed environment ever designed by man. The obsession with oversized weapons blinded the high command to the practical needs of the soldiers. The standard troops needed reliable medium tanks and massive amounts of standard field guns to hold the lines. They did not need a mythical land battleship that drained the shrinking national resources. The massive cannons were a symbol of ego rather than a practical tool for winning the conflict. The dictators in Berlin wanted to boast about possessing the largest guns in the history of the world. They ignored the fact that a weapon is useless if it cannot hit the intended target. The Allied commanders would have laughed at the sheer absurdity of the massive naval turret. They understood that 100 fast tanks could outmaneuver and destroy a single lumbering giant. The Ratte was a monument to the strategic failures of a collapsing empire. The designers spent countless hours calculating the ballistics of the massive guns on paper. They drew beautiful sketches of the Landkreuzer obliterating enemy fortresses from miles away. But paper does not reflect the harsh conditions of the mud and the freezing rain. The theoretical destruction promised by the naval guns was a fantasy born of pure desperation. The impossible tank was a desperate attempt to rewrite the rules of war with brute force alone. But the battlefield cares nothing for grand visions or impossible blueprints. The supreme firepower of the Ratte was its own worst enemy in the end. The sheer scale of the weapons guaranteed the machine could never function as a practical tool of war. The giant guns were a fatal flaw disguised as an unstoppable advantage. The most terrifying aspect of the giant machine was not the massive naval guns or the thick steel armor. The true horror of the project was the fact that senior engineers treated the impossible idea as fact. Men of science and practical combat experience sat in warm offices and drafted plans for pure madness. The German war effort was collapsing under the massive weight of the Allied advance from both sides. Factories burned to the ground, and soldiers froze in the mud without winter gear or spare ammunition. Yet the Supreme Command diverted brilliant minds to calculate the track width of a 1,000-ton monster. The dictator in Berlin, obsessed over massive weapons to turn the tide of his failing empire, he demanded wonder weapons that could shatter the morale of the enemy and win the war in one day. The concept of the giant land cruiser fed his grand illusions of absolute and undeniable power. He gave the official order to proceed with the design phase of the colossal steel beast. Professional draftsmen spent thousands of hours sketching the internal bulkheads and the massive engine rooms. They calculated the stress on the steel plates and the exact placement of the anti-aircraft turrets. Piles of detailed blueprints filled the desks of the men tasked with saving the desperate nation. The sheer amount of wasted brainpower was a strategic disaster for the collapsing German armies. These engineers possessed the skill to solve the mechanical flaws of the standard tanks fighting the war. They possessed the talent to design better weapons for the desperate infantry units holding the broken lines. Instead, they poured their genius into a fantasy machine that defied the laws of basic physics. The disconnect between the high command and the grim reality of the battlefield reached absolute peak madness. The officers on the front begged for fuel trucks and simple replacement parts for their broken machines. The leaders in the capital promised them a moving fortress that would crush entire cities under its treads. The gap between the desperate needs of the soldiers and the massive ego of the dictator was fatal. The blueprints of the giant tank represented the ultimate triumph of pure delusion over harsh reality. The engineers knew the European infrastructure could never support the weight of the massive land cruiser. They knew the submarine engines would consume the scarce fuel reserves of the entire armored division. They understood the behemoth would become a massive target for the thousands of Allied bombers in the sky. But fear and blind obedience forced the men of science to continue the absurd charade. Speaking against the grand vision of the dictator was a fast path to a firing squad. The design bureaus became echo chambers of impossible promises and fabricated technical specifications. The engineers lied to their commanders, and the commanders lied to the desperate dictator in his bunker. The entire chain of command embraced the massive lie of the invincible 1,000-ton weapon. They discussed the logistics of building a dedicated shipyard on land to construct the giant hull. The project required massive industrial cranes and thousands of slave laborers to assemble the thick steel plates. A construction site of that magnitude would invite relentless bombing raids before the first track was laid. The Allied reconnaissance planes would photograph the massive skeleton taking shape in the dirt. The bomber fleets would erase the construction yard from the map in a storm of high explosives. Building the beast was just as impossible as driving it across the ruined landscape of the war. But the detailed sketches of the Ratte provided a psychological escape for the doomed leaders of the regime. Staring at the massive naval cannons on paper allowed them to forget the approaching Allied armies. The blueprints offered a comfortable fantasy, where German engineering could still conquer the entire world. The impossible tank became a paper shield against the terrifying truth of their impending defeat. The massive steel fortress existed in the minds of the desperate men who refused to accept the end. The resources wasted on the intricate drawings could have saved thousands of lives on the active front. The steel meant for practical weapons remained in the ground while the engineers chased a mechanical ghost. The Grand Land Cruiser was a parasite draining the final drops of life from the collapsing war effort. The men in the trenches died waiting for reinforcements, while the generals dreamed of a moving mountain. The story of the blueprints is a testament to the destructive power of unchecked human ego. The desire for a supreme weapon blinded the greatest engineering minds to the basic laws of nature. They tried to build a god of war out of steel and massive submarine engines. But gods of war do not survive the brutal friction of the mud and the freezing rain. The detailed schematics of the behemoth stand as a monument to a staggering loss of perspective. The smartest men in the room spent their final days designing a machine that could never exist. The massive naval turrets and the thick armor plates remained trapped in the realm of pure fiction. The giant tracks never touched the earth, and the submarine engines never roared to life. The grand vision of the invincible Landkreuzer crumbled under the weight of its own impossible ambition. The project was a profound failure of leadership disguised as a miracle of modern engineering. The men who drew the plans knew the truth hidden behind the impressive numbers and the thick lines. They knew the Ratte was nothing but a desperate hallucination born from the ashes of a dying empire. The blueprints serve as a dark reminder of what happens when dictators ignore the laws of physics. The impossible tank was the final chaotic gasp of a regime obsessed with size and absolute destruction. The fantasy faded away as the reality of the war crashed through the walls of their comfortable offices. The giant machine never fired a shot and never crushed a single enemy town under its treads. The grand delusion remained trapped on paper, while the real war decided the fate of the world. The ultimate weapon was defeated by the sheer absurdity of its own massive existence. The impossible tank is the greatest symbol of an empire that lost touch with the real world. The behemoth could never work because the men who designed it had forgotten how the real world operated. The massive blueprints of the giant tank sat on the heavy oak desks of the High Command. The detailed drawings of the Landkreuzer represented a staggering waste of national resources and human intellect. The dictator in Berlin demanded the construction of the beast regardless of the immense practical problems. But a single voice of reason emerged from the chaotic echo chamber of the falling empire. The Minister of Armaments took one look at the intricate plans and recognized the absolute madness. He understood the grim mathematics of the war and the desperate need for standard combat vehicles. He saw a 1,000-ton hallucination masquerading as a brilliant triumph of modern mechanical engineering. The minister knew the immense steel required for one Ratte could build a massive fleet of practical machines. He recognized the giant naval turrets were a foolish drain on the collapsing industrial sector. The minister visited the design bureaus and confronted the brilliant men drawing the impossible machine. He asked them how a vehicle of that magnitude could cross the soft mud of the Eastern Front. The engineers stared at their shoes and offered no practical solutions to his harsh and direct questions. They could not explain how the giant tracks would survive the massive craters of the ruined roads. They possessed no answer for the immense thirst of the twin submarine engines roaring in the dark. The men of science knew the project was doomed, but feared the wrath of their obsessed leader. The minister possessed the rare courage to speak the absolute truth to the frantic high command. He outlined the catastrophic logistical nightmare of fueling a moving fortress in a bombed and shattered landscape. He pointed to the sky and reminded the generals of the immense Allied bomber formations. A machine the size of a large building was nothing but a slow target for the enemy planes. The minister argued that the thick steel plates offered zero protection against a coordinated aerial assault. The giant tank would become a massive burning monument to the sheer arrogance of the regime. He presented the cold, hard facts of the crumbling infrastructure across the European continent. No bridge could hold the immense weight, and no standard train could transport the massive spare parts. The Ratte would have to drive under its own power from the factories to the distant combat zones. That long journey across the continent would destroy the tracks and exhaust the crew before the battle began. The massive vibration of the submarine engines would shatter the internal mechanics over hundreds of miles. The supreme weapon would arrive at the front as a broken and useless mountain of scrap metal. The logic of the minister pierced the thick fog of delusion surrounding the desperate military leaders. He forced the high command to look at the burning ruins of their own shattered cities. The nation needed massive numbers of reliable weapons to defend the borders against the approaching armies. Investing millions of man-hours into a single impossible prototype was an act of strategic suicide. The order to cancel the colossal project came down swift and hard from the Ministry of Armaments. The brilliant engineers received commands to pack up their massive blueprints and abandon the giant Landkreuzer. The massive naval turrets destined for the dirt were sent back to the coastal defense batteries. The submarine engines went to the naval yards to power the desperate underwater war in the Atlantic. The raw steel meant for the thick armor plates was diverted to the production of standard tanks. The cancellation of the Ratte marked a rare moment of sheer sanity in a regime consumed by madness. The ministers saved the German war effort from wasting its final breath on a mechanical fairy tale. The giant machine died on the drafting tables before a single piece of steel was forged. The dream of the invincible 1,000-ton fortress vanished into the shadows of the collapsing empire. The engineers returned to the grim task of designing practical weapons for the desperate men in the trenches. The grandiose visions of the dictator were replaced by the harsh and bitter realities of imminent defeat. But the ghost of the giant tank lingered in the minds of the men who drew the plans. They had spent months calculating the exact dimensions of a god of war that would never exist. The sheer scale of the project left a permanent mark on the history of armored vehicle design. The Ratte became an ultimate symbol of what happens when ambition ignores the rigid laws of physics. The human desire for absolute power blinded the greatest engineers to the limits of the natural world. They forgot that the Earth itself dictates the rules of combat and the boundaries of massive machines. The mud and the rivers of Europe formed an impenetrable defense against the 1,000-ton monster. The Allied bomber fleets guaranteed that the giant target would never survive a single day in the sun. The Minister of Armaments understood these fatal flaws and executed the impossible dream with a stroke of his pen. The sudden death of the project spared thousands of slave laborers from the brutal construction yards. It prevented the creation of a moving tomb for the doomed crew tasked with operating the beast. The cancellation was a harsh but necessary dose of reality for a command structure lost in deep delusion. The Allied intelligence officers later discovered the massive blueprints hidden in the captured German archives. They stared at the intricate drawings of the Landkreuzer with a mixture of awe and absolute confusion. The victorious generals could not comprehend how a modern army could entertain such a massive and foolish endeavor. The sketches of the Ratte provided a chilling look into the desperate mindset of the defeated regime. The massive tank was the mechanical embodiment of an empire that believed it could conquer the impossible. But the harsh environment of the battlefield cares nothing for the grand illusions of desperate and failing men. The giant Landkreuzer was defeated by the simple limits of fuel, steel, and common sense. The invincible weapon was conquered by a minister who chose practical survival over a massive and useless spectacle. The greatest tank ever designed was brought down by the sheer weight of its own absurd existence. The blueprints remain as a fascinating warning to future generations of mechanical engineers and military strategists. The story of the colossal failure proves that bigger is never a substitute for smart and reliable design. The 1,000-ton nightmare died in the dark so the real machines of war could continue the fight. The grand vision of the giant machine was born out of touch with the modern era of combat. The generals who ordered the massive tank grew up fighting a much older and slower war. They remembered the deep mud and the static trenches of the previous global conflict. In those ancient battles of attrition, thick armor and massive guns defined the ultimate victor. A moving fortress made sense when the front lines remained frozen in place for months, but the nature of the battlefield had undergone a massive and violent evolution. The new era of mechanized warfare demanded intense speed and constant aggressive movement. Fast armored divisions proved that breaking the enemy lines required agility and rapid penetration. A 1,000-ton steel mountain possessed zero capacity for the swift maneuvers that defined modern tactics. The giant land cruiser was a dinosaur walking into a world of fast predators. The massive weight doomed the machine to a pace slower than a marching foot soldier. The enemy commanders could see the slow beast approaching from a massive distance. They could outflank the behemoth and sever the vulnerable transport routes feeding the submarine engines. The Ratte was a massive medieval castle placed in the middle of a high-speed armored war. It was obsolete before the first draftsman even touched his pencil to the paper. The designers ignored the harsh lessons of the initial successful blitzkrieg campaigns across the continent. Those victories depended on radio communication and swift strikes to paralyze the defending armies. A giant and deafening steel bunker could never coordinate with fast units racing across the plains. The massive noise inside the hull prevented the crew from hearing vital combat orders. The sheer size of the machine isolated the men from the rest of the armored spearhead. They were a slow and blind giant, stumbling through a fast and chaotic combat zone. The greatest shift in warfare came from the clouds, high above the dirt and the mud. Air power dictated the outcome of every single major engagement in the European theater. The skies belonged to swarms of fast fighters and massive formations of heavy bombers. The German High Command suffered from a fatal blind spot regarding this new vertical threat. They believed thick steel plates could protect the giant machine from the wrath of the heavens. But the Allied bombs carried enough kinetic energy to crack open the strongest armored shell. The era of the invincible land battleship was a pure myth created by desperate men. The true power of a tank is the ability to strike hard and vanish into the terrain. The massive land cruiser sacrificed the power of evasion for the illusion of absolute invulnerability. The enemy forces did not need to pierce the thick frontal armor to defeat the giant. They just needed to destroy the soft earth and the fragile bridges surrounding the heavy tracks. The environment itself became the perfect trap for the 1,000-ton machine. The Allied generals understood that immense size is a severe disadvantage in a war of motion. A smaller and faster machine can survive to fight another day in the brush. The Ratte possessed no place to hide and no speed to escape a coordinated ambush. The designers of the behemoth chased a phantom concept of absolute and undeniable dominance. They wanted a weapon that could terrorize the world with pure size and massive naval cannons. But terror is a poor substitute for practical engineering and basic tactical flexibility. The men on the drawing boards wasted precious time designing an overgrown relic of a past age. The real heroes of the armored divisions needed reliable machines that could cross the muddy fields. They needed simple engines that a mechanic could fix in the dark with basic tools. The submarine power plants of the giant tank required a team of specialized marine engineers. Repairing the internal gears of the behemoth demanded massive industrial hoists and pristine workshop conditions. The dirt and the grime of the front lines would destroy the complex internal mechanisms. The project represents the ultimate triumph of massive ego over cold and calculated reason. The dictators and the generals wanted a monument to their own perceived greatness. They forgot that war is a brutal test of efficiency and harsh practical limits. The Allied armies won the conflict with massive fleets of simple and mass-produced vehicles. They overwhelmed the complex and over-engineered German machines with sheer numbers and reliable performance. The giant tank was the absolute antithesis of this winning formula. The creation of a single Ratte would consume the resources needed for 100 standard tanks. The impossible dream starved the men holding the collapsing lines against the advancing enemy forces. The massive land cruiser was a strategic vampire draining the life from the entire nation. The end of the war proved that the age of the superweapon was a pure fiction. The giant land cruiser died because the rules of combat evolved beyond massive static targets. Speed and air supremacy replaced thick steel and oversized naval cannons. The ghost of the Ratte serves as a permanent lesson for modern military engineers. The desire to build the biggest machine must bow to the harsh demands of the actual battlefield. 1,000 tons of steel is nothing but a massive tomb if it cannot move. The impossible tank remains a fascinating footnote in the dark history of global conflict. It shows the sheer madness that consumes a failing empire, desperate for a magical salvation. The giant machine was a massive iron beast that the modern world refused to accept. The era of the land battleship never began because the sky and the mud forbade it. The Ratte stands as the ultimate symbol of a grand delusion, crushed by the reality of war. The massive blueprints are a testament to the fatal flaw of ignoring the modern battlefield. The massive blueprints of the Landkreuzer remain a profound monument to pure human arrogance. The designers believed they could conquer the natural world with thick steel and massive cannons. They wanted to build a god of war that would crush the spirit of the enemy forces. But the engineers forgot the most basic and fundamental rule of global armored conflict. The Earth itself dictates the boundaries of what a machine can achieve in the dirt. A weapon of war must adapt to the harsh environment of the shattered landscape. The environment will never adapt to accommodate a 1,000-ton steel fortress. The mud and the deep rivers of Europe formed an absolute and impenetrable barrier. The ancient stone bridges stood as a silent defense against the massive tracks of the beast. The Allied bomber formations in the sky waited to turn the giant machine into scrap metal. The desperate dictator in Berlin demanded a miracle to save his collapsing empire. He poured the fading genius of his nation into a project that defied all common sense. The best minds of a generation wasted their final days calculating the impossible. They designed a moving mountain that starved the real soldiers fighting in the frozen trenches. The cancellation of the project was the one moment of profound sanity in a mad regime. The Minister of Armaments saw the massive delusion and killed the beast on the drafting table. The giant tank never fired a single round in anger and never crushed a single enemy town. The grand and terrifying vision of the massive land cruiser was defeated by harsh physics. The impossible machine was a spectacular failure, born from the ashes of a dying command structure. In the end, it was not the armed forces of the enemy that stopped the supreme weapon. The ultimate land battleship was stopped cold by the unbreakable laws of absolute reality. So look at the massive size of this proposed monster and ask yourself a simple question. Would you want to be trapped inside a 1,000-ton target while the bombers circle above? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell me what you think of this massive engineering failure. Hit that subscribe button to join our relentless pursuit of combat history. I will see you in the next dark chapter of human warfare.